the Vethani envoy dropped the demand scroll onto the center of the deliberation floor and stepped back without bowing. Warlord Thurrek requires a response within 4 rotations, the envoy said. Corridor rights for passages 7, 12, and 19. Full transit authority, or the Conclave should expect an audit of its outer perimeter. Councillor Drath Ven of the Kaelori Conclave sat very still. Around her, 11 other council seats held representatives doing exactly what she was doing, calculating how badly this could go. The Vethani did not audit perimeters. They blockaded them. The word audit had a particular weight in a room that remembered the last time Thurrek's fleet had approached a station under that same diplomatic framing. Grand Arbiter Sok lifted one of his 4 hands from the armrest. The Conclave will take the demand under consideration. The Vethani envoy left without another word. His footsteps clicked across the stone floor in the silence left behind him. Then the hall erupted. Drathven did not join the noise. She sat and thought. 3 corridors was not a negotiating position. It was a pressure test. If the Conclave gave Thurrek those passages, every fringe faction watching this exchange would learn something simple and dangerous. The Kaelori responded to direct threats with direct concessions. That lesson would cost more than 3 corridors. It would cost the structural credibility that the Conclave had spent 40 years building in the outer sectors. But Thurrek was not wrong that the Conclave had nothing sharp to answer him with. They had trade fleets and diplomatic infrastructure and a legal framework that assumed good faith participation from all parties. They had no one in the current roster who knew how to sit across from a dominant posture Vethani Warlord and remain completely, unhurriedly unmoved. Drathven thought about a report she had received the previous month. A contact in the Southern Assembly had forwarded it almost as a curiosity. A case study in a territorial dispute resolution between 2 Moriac subclans. A human cultural attaché named Velde had resolved it by doing nothing more dramatic than documenting every promise each party had broken over the previous decade, presenting the compiled record in writing and waiting. No theater, no ultimatum, no raised voice that anyone could push back against. The Moriac had simply found that waiting him out was more exhausting than reaching an agreement, because waiting him out meant watching him continue to build the record, and no one wanted to see where that record ended. Drathven reached for her communication tablet before the noise in the hall had died down. Marcus Velde read the briefing on his way to the docking port. Sera read it over his shoulder, then walked ahead of him to board first while he was still on the second page. "You're not finished," she said. "I'm finished with the part that matters," Marcus said. He folded the tablet away. Thurrek's faction has run this same pattern against 3 different trade partners in the last 2 years. Every time, they made a demand, applied pressure, extracted a partial concession, and then returned at a larger scale. Classic ratchet. Each concession teaches them that concessions are available. Sera pulled her satchel onto the overhead rack, and every partner assumed giving a little would stop it. "Yes." "And you were chosen because?" Marcus sat down and thought about it with the specific honesty he brought to questions about his own positioning. "Because I have a documented file on every concession the Kaelori have made in the last decade. I'm not Kaelori, so I carry none of their particular political debt. and I apparently have a reputation in the Assembly's secondary networks for finishing what I start. Sera looked at him for a moment. That is a polite way of saying you hold grudges. I prefer to say I maintain comprehensive records. She did not argue with that. She pulled out her own work and began reviewing Vethani cultural documentation. She was the analytical half of this arrangement, the one who would be parsing tone and gesture during the sessions, reading what the translator units could not capture. She had spent 8 years studying nonverbal communication patterns across 6 species. If Thurrek made a move that did not translate cleanly to language, Sera would see it and name it before anyone else in the room had registered that something had happened. The transport left the dock. Marcus went back to the briefing. He read it twice more. They arrived at Kaelori Station Vethis-Anchor 40 hours later. The station had been built deliberately at the intersection of the 3 contested corridors, which made it politically symbolic and physically inconvenient in equal measure. The docking arms were undersized for standard commercial vessels, and the gravity calibration ran a quarter unit high throughout all residential and meeting sections, a result of the station's position in a mild gravitational gradient that no one had ever corrected, because correcting it would require taking the station offline for 3 weeks. Marcus noticed the elevated gravity within 30 seconds of boarding. He adjusted his posture and his stride. No comment, no complaint. Just adjustment. Counselor Drath Ven met them at the arrival gate. She was tall and slate-colored, with the articulated secondary fingers that Kaelori used to punctuate and shade their communication. Those fingers were spread slightly now, held low at her sides in what Sera had described during the transit review as provisional welcome, offered carefully, not yet committed, still evaluating whether commitment was warranted. "You are the Velde delegation," Drath Ven said. "We are," Marcus said. "Thank you for the briefing materials. I have a few questions about the session access schedules, specifically the documentation archiving protocol." Drath Ven had prepared pleasantries. She had expected pleasantries in return. Instead, she processed the words access and schedules and questions and redirected. "The session rooms are prepared. I can walk you through the structure before the first formal meeting." "That would be useful," Marcus said. He did not say it would be wonderful, or that he was grateful for her excellent hospitality, or that he looked forward to a productive collaboration. He said it would be useful and meant it precisely. Drath Ven noticed the exactness of the response. She filed it. Sera was already studying the station layout posted on the corridor wall, noting distances between sections, locations of the independent monitoring office, the nearest communication relay, the routes between the negotiation suite and the residential wing. She had a habit of knowing the geography of any space she entered before she needed to move through it quickly. She called it professional preparation. Marcus called it the same thing. The first planning session with the Kaelori delegation ran 2 hours and 10 minutes. Marcus asked questions and listened to answers and took notes. When the Kaelori's senior trade specialist explained that previous negotiations with Vethani factions had always opened with a material gesture of goodwill, a gift of some kind, a token concession offered in advance to signal respect and good faith, Marcus said, "We are not doing that here." Silence fell on the room with some weight. Every concession before the first session teaches Thurrek that concessions are available before the session has even begun. Marcus said. I understand that gesture is embedded in Kaelori negotiating tradition. I understand it signals respect and positions you as reasonable actors. It will not function correctly with Thurrek specifically. Based on his documented behavior, he will not read it as respect. He will read it as an indication of your tolerance for loss. Drathven's secondary fingers extended. That is a significant departure from how we have conducted these sessions. It is, Marcus said, and did not soften what came next. I want you to know clearly that I am not making this recommendation because I believe I understand Kaelori diplomatic culture better than you do. I am changing this specific element because Thurrek's own pattern shows he responds to opening gestures by escalating his initial demand. If my read of him is wrong, I will take full and formal responsibility for that call in front of Grand Arbiter Sock. That offer is on the record starting now. The room absorbed this. Taking responsibility in advance, explicitly and voluntarily, in front of witnesses, was not a pattern the Kaelori negotiators had encountered from a visiting envoy before. Drathven's second-in-command, a young station administrator named Pell, leaned slightly forward and wrote something in his notes. He had been introduced as a documentation assistant. He was clearly more attentive than that role typically required. We will proceed as you recommend, Drathven said. After a pause that contained some internal calculation Marcus did not have access to. For the first session, thank you, Marcus said. He meant that one precisely too. Warlord Thurrek arrived the following morning with 6 Vethani subordinates, a personal guard complement that met the station's maximum allowance by a margin so thin it was clearly a considered choice, and a physical presence that was designed to be processed before he spoke a single word. He was a head taller than his own subordinates. His crest, the layered cartilage ridge that ran from his brow to the base of his skull, was fully elevated, held at the maximum extension that signaled dominant display. He had made this decision before entering the station, probably before boarding his vessel. He had decided he was the most significant being in any room he would enter here, and he intended that decision to be visible from across a corridor. His guard arranged themselves in the hallways, outside the negotiation suite in positions that were technically compliant with the station's security protocols, and practically designed to ensure that any Kaelori staff member walking past would have to pass within 2 body lengths of a Vethani guard standing at full height. Small, precise pressure, the kind that accumulated without providing anything to formally object to. Marcus watched Thurrek walk into the negotiation suite and did not stand up. This was not an accident. It had been deliberate since the previous evening. Standing to greet a Vethani dominant posture entry would be read as an acknowledgement of the hierarchy Thurrek was presenting. It would confirm, before a single word had been exchanged, that he had successfully established his position at the top of the room. Sera had flagged this in the transit briefing. Marcus had been looking at his session documentation when Thurrek entered, and he looked up with the specific neutral expression of someone who had been working and had now been interrupted, not someone who had been waiting in anticipation. Thurrek stopped. He looked at the human. He looked at the empty seat at the head of the table, which Marcus had not taken. He looked at Drathven, who had taken her assigned seat at the table's midpoint. Then he sat. The first session was procedural. Marcus presented the framework for discussion. He did not lead with grievances, offers, or positions. He presented structure, what would be addressed in what order, with what documentation standards, and how any new items introduced outside the framework would be handled. Thurrek's delegation had prepared to receive or reject an opening offer. They had not prepared for structured procedure. They were, by the end of the first hour, very slightly off balance in a way that did not show in any individual moment, but accumulated into a general unreadiness. Marcus noticed. He showed nothing. The first genuine test came on the second day. Thurrek's primary negotiating officer, a scarred Vethani named Drekth, whose rank insignia indicated he had been doing this work for considerably longer than his direct superior, had been a warlord, produced a secondary document that had not appeared in the formal demand submission. It was titled, in the translation, as a set of clarifying conditions. The content included a provision granting Vethani vessels unrestricted inspection authority over any cargo transiting the 3 contested corridors during any period when Vethani interests were under active review. Marcus read the document. He set it on the table. This was not in the formal submission. It clarifies the formal submission, Drekth said. It adds a new demand, Marcus said. We can address it in session 4, which is scheduled for secondary items. We will not address it today. Warlord Thurrek considers this matter time-sensitive. I understand, Marcus said. It goes in session 4. Drekth glanced at Thurrek. Thurrek made a small gesture, a forward flick of his secondary claw against the table surface, which translated in Vethani, signaling as something like push it through or force the issue. Drekth slid the document back across the table. The warlord requires a response today, Drekth said. Marcus picked up the document, walked to the session's documentation port on the wall, scanned it into the official record, and returned to his seat. It is now formally entered with today's date and time. We will address it in session 4, as scheduled. If your delegation introduces additional items outside the established framework, those will also be formally entered and scheduled. Nothing presented here goes unanswered. Nothing jumps the queue. He said it in the same register he used for procedural statements. Informational. Without heat, without challenge, without anything for Drekth to push against directly. Thurrek's crest shifted. Not a large movement, a recalibration. That evening, Sera told Marcus that Drekth had spent approximately 12 minutes standing in the corridor, near the Kaelori delegation's residential section. Not knocking on any door. Just standing in a position where his presence would be visible to anyone who looked through the corridor's transparent wall panels. He was checking if the pressure would produce a private conversation, she said. Someone who wanted to make a side arrangement. Did anyone respond? Pell looked out twice, nervous face both times. Did not open the door. Good, Marcus said. Log it with the exact times. She had already done that. The pressure seal in the station's secondary life support junction failed on the 3rd day, midway through the morning session. It was a minor failure by the station's own maintenance classification, the kind that happened periodically in older infrastructure and triggered a standard response from the environmental technical crew. The affected section included the negotiation suite's primary ventilation intake. Within 20 minutes, the room temperature had dropped 4 degrees in an uneven gradient. Cold air pooled on the eastern side of the room where the Vethani delegation sat. The western side remained warmer. This created a thermal differential that was imperceptible to the Kaelori and invisible to Marcus, but which the Vethani delegation registered as a physiological stressor. Vethani comfortable operating temperature was a narrow band, and asymmetric cold produced a specific kind of low-level irritability in their response systems that they could suppress, but that required active effort to do so. Drathven's administrators began calling for a session pause. Two of them were already debating which backup meeting room was structurally appropriate under the station's facility charter for a formally convened negotiation. Thurrek's subordinates were exchanging glances in the pattern Sera recognized as preparation to reframe the environmental issue as a deliberate discourtesy. Marcus had already left the room. He came back 14 minutes later with two of the station's environmental technicians, a portable thermal equalization unit on a wheeled mount, and a working knowledge of the exact access panel locations for the secondary ventilation junction. He had gathered the second piece of information during a conversation with the station's maintenance supervisor on day 1. He had asked where the environmental vulnerabilities were. The supervisor had told him because he had asked simply and directly and offered nothing in exchange, and people generally answered direct questions from someone who looked like they would actually use the information. The technicians deployed the equalizer. Marcus ran a bypass confirmation on the secondary intake valve, cross-checking against the station's schematic on his tablet. The thermal differential corrected within 22 minutes of his return. The Kaelori administrators were still debating the charter question when the room temperature stabilized. Thurrek watched the human fix something that was not the human's assigned role to fix, in a room that had been built for talking, using knowledge he had gathered before anyone knew it would matter. He said nothing. His crest settled from its full elevation by a small but measurable degree. It was not respect. It was the involuntary recalibration of a dominant posture individual who had arrived with a clear model of what the creature across the table was, and had just found that model was insufficient. Pell, who had watched the entire sequence from his documentation position, asked Marcus afterward how he had known where to find the thermal equalization unit. "I asked the maintenance supervisor on the first morning," Marcus said. "Any space you work in has failure points. I prefer to know where they are before they become relevant." Pell wrote this down in his personal notes, not the official session record. That was the first time he had written something in his personal notes. Sera's observation came on the 4th day. She brought it to Drathven privately before the session opened and requested a meeting with the Kaelori's cultural documentation team. She was not interrupting or diverting from the negotiation. She was doing what she had been brought to do, which was to track the cultural subtext of the exchange and surface anything that might produce a consequential misunderstanding before the misunderstanding produced a crisis. She had been watching Thurrek's personal guard rotation for 3 days. The 6 guards he had brought were rotating shifts in a pattern that deviated from standard Vethani security protocol in a specific way. In the standard protocol, a dominant figure's personal guard placed themselves to screen for external threat, meaning they faced outward. One of Thurrek's guards maintained a consistent position, oriented not toward external approach vectors, but toward Thurrek himself, at an angle that provided clear sightlines to the warlord's face and hands. In Vethani internal signaling, that positioning had a specific meaning. It indicated an individual monitoring a dominant figure's conduct on behalf of a higher authority. Someone in Thurrek's own command structure was watching this negotiation independently of Thurrek's own reporting. Drath then brought in the Kaelori cultural scholar, Voss, an elderly, careful person who had spent 30 years studying Vethani social architecture. Voss confirmed the positioning analysis without hesitation. If the placement pattern is as described, Thurrek is operating under observation from his own hierarchy. The warlord does not have full autonomous authority in this room, Sera said, which means the demands he is presenting may not be entirely his own agenda, which means, Voss said, there is a set of interests behind this negotiation that we have not been shown. Sera brought this to Marcus that evening. He was quiet for 4 minutes, which she knew from experience meant he was restructuring something in his analytical framework. Not that he was uncertain or slow. Then he pulled out the documentation of the 3 previous trade partner negotiations that Thurrek had run and went through them methodically. 45 minutes later, he pushed his chair back. In each previous case, he said, the final concession the partner gave was not the item Thurrek opened with. It was different in each case, but in each case, the final concession gave Thurrek's faction a specific operational access to transit data, not material goods or route control. Someone has been using these negotiations to build intelligence on corridor traffic patterns. Not Thurrek, Sera asked. Thurrek is producing a result for someone. Whether he knows the full scope of what he is producing is a different question. Sera said, that changes what Session 4 should look like. Yes, Marcus said. Good catch. She had been looking for exactly that thread since day 2. That was how she worked. Session 4 opened with Marcus placing Drechth's secondary demand document on the table, as promised, addressing it item by item, and systematically rejecting each subclause with documented precedent from the Galactic Compact's transit sovereignty provisions. He had spent the previous evening preparing the citations. He had prepared more than he expected to need, because preparation of that kind was something he simply did, the way he had always done it, without treating it as exceptional effort. The rejection of each subclause took 2 hours and 20 minutes. Drechth had not expected thorough preparation. He had expected objection, counter-demand, and eventual compromise. He had not expected a citation-supported walkthrough of why each component was non-compliant with standing law. By the end of it, he was sitting slightly differently than he had at the start of the session. At the conclusion, Thurrek himself spoke in the direct session for the first time. "You are a thorough creature," he said. His translator rendered the words in a neutral register, but Sera caught the crest movement that accompanied them, a specific lateral shift that in Vethani expression indicated something between grudging acknowledgement and reassessment. "Thank you," Marcus said. "It changes nothing. The corridors are a practical operational necessity for Vethani commercial interests." "I understand that is the stated position," Marcus said. "We have not yet placed the operational data on the table for both sides to examine. I would like to propose we do that tomorrow, with full transit logs from both the Kaelori and Vethani systems. If the necessity is genuine, the data will demonstrate it clearly. If my concerns about the pattern of these demands are genuine, the data will demonstrate that too. I have no objection to being shown I'm wrong." Thurrek looked at him. You are proposing data sharing. I am proposing that we look at what the numbers actually say before we argue about what they mean, Marcus said. If your operational need is real, you lose nothing by showing it. That evening, the guard Sera had identified as an observer transmitted a short, encrypted message to an external address. The station's communication relay logged the transmission time, duration, and destination identifier automatically. Sera noted all three. She did not bring it to the station's security office. She noted it and waited and added it to the document she had been building since day one. The shift that mattered most in the room came from Pell. On the fifth morning, before the session opened, Pell came to Marcus in the documentation staging area and said, quietly, and with the slightly compressed posture of someone who was not accustomed to initiating conversations with senior delegates, that he had found something in the historical transit records that he thought might be worth knowing. Marcus set down what he was working on. He looked at Pell directly. "Show me." Pell showed him. It was a set of corridor transit logs from 7 years prior, from before the current formalized corridor structure had been ratified. At that time, Passage 12, the second of the 3 corridors under negotiation, had operated under a joint use arrangement with a species called the Aerith, a commercial trading power that had since collapsed under internal debt and was no longer an active galactic actor. The Aerith had maintained a network of navigational beacons through Passage 12 during that period. The beacons had been installed to support their commercial fleet operations. No one had formally decommissioned those beacons when the Aerith partnership ended. They were still present. They still transmitted on a low-band frequency. Anyone holding the Aerith encoding keys could query those beacons remotely and receive detailed information about ship movements through Passage 12 without the Kaelori's knowledge. Pell had cross-referenced the Aerith commercial partnership history with the Vethani foreign trade alliances of the same period. The Vethani had maintained an active commercial relationship with Aerith trading houses for 9 years. That relationship had included a data-sharing provision. They had the encoding keys. Marcus read through Pell's documentation carefully and completely. He did not rush. Then he looked at the young Kaelori administrator. "This is the structural core of what has been happening here," Marcus said. Thurrek's faction does not want to control Passage 12. They want the legal right to operate within it, which would give them formal cover to run the beacon network openly instead of covertly. The trade negotiation is a cover operation for a covert intelligence structure that has been running for years. Pell's secondary fingers spread and closed and spread again. He was processing the fact that something he had found in historical records had turned out to matter at this level. "Is this useful for the session today?" "It is central to the session today," Marcus said. "I want you at the table, not at the documentation station, not taking notes, sitting at the table." Pell looked alarmed in the specific way of someone who had been told his function was one thing and was now being told it was something else. "That is outside my assigned role." "Your assigned role is documentation," Marcus said. "You documented something that changes the entire basis of this negotiation. The person who found it needs to be present when we use it, because you understand the records better than anyone in that room, and Drathven may need to follow the source chain in real time. Can you walk her through it if she needs it?" Pell thought about this for 3 seconds. "Yes," he said. "Then your role just changed," Marcus said. "You could take a different seat." The formal banquet on the 6th evening was a Kaelori tradition at the midpoint of any multi-session negotiation. Drathven had explained it was expected by all parties, and that declining it would be read as a signal of bad faith, which was the last signal they needed to send at this stage of the proceedings. Marcus had agreed with 3 specific conditions. He wanted the seating layout in advance. He wanted the translation coverage plan confirmed. And he wanted to know who was covering the documentation of any significant exchanges that occurred in the informal setting, because in his experience, informal settings were where significant exchanges most often happened and least often got recorded. All 3 were provided. He reviewed them the night before and had no objections. What no one had built a protocol for was what Thurrek decided to do with the absence of a formal agenda. The banquet was in its 2nd hour. The conversation at Marcus's end of the long table had been careful and productive. Pell was engaged in a quiet technical discussion with one of Thurrek's mid-rank subordinates about navigational terminology, building the kind of working rapport that sometimes produced useful candor. Drathven was speaking with 2 of her own senior advisors about corridor boundary history. Marcus was listening to a Vethani trade logistics officer describe the practical operational problems with the current corridor access protocols, which was useful information regardless of the strategic context around it. And he was listening with the specific attention of someone who intended to remember everything that was said. Sera was at the opposite end of the table. She was in conversation with Voss and with Drathven's cultural liaison about the question of how Vethani expressions of authority had shifted over the last 4 generations, and what that shift indicated about the internal tensions in current Vethani governance. It was the kind of conversation she was very good at conducting, drawing out specific and honest analysis from someone who knew more than they had been asked to say, by asking the right question at the right moment. Thurrek came down the length of the table. He had been standing near his own delegation's end of the room, speaking with no one in particular, holding his crest at partial elevation. He moved slowly in the way a dominant posture Vethani moved when making a deliberate point about who occupied a space. His personal guard followed at the required formal distance. His movement drew attention without requiring it, the way a large object moving across a room drew the eye. He stopped beside Sera's chair. She was mid-sentence in a response to Voss. She looked up. Thurrek said, in a tone his translator rendered as flat and declarative, "You are attached to the human envoy. Your analysis in this setting carries no independent standing." Sera held his gaze. "My analysis carries the weight of what is documented behind it." Thurrek looked at her. The pause was perhaps 2 seconds. Then he brought his hand across and struck her on the side of the face. It was controlled, precise. In Vethani social convention, it was the gesture of formal dismissal, used to indicate that an individual's continued presence in a status conversation was below the threshold of engagement. It was not the maximum force Thurrek was capable of generating. It was calibrated to the cultural meaning, not to physical harm. In Vethani tradition, it was not assault. It was a public statement about rank, made with physical contact, the way other species made it with words. The room stopped. Sera did not fall. She was seated and the contact was controlled, and she held completely still for 2 full seconds. Then she turned back to Drathven, who'd gone rigid in her chair with an expression that, on a Kaelori, indicated a level of horror that was very close to fury, and said in a voice that did not waver, "I would like to note the time for the record." Drathven said something to her cultural aide. The aide reached for a documentation device. Marcus was at the other end of the table. He had seen it happen. The distance was the full length of the room. Every person in the space was now looking at him, with the specific attention of an audience waiting for a cue, because what happened next depended on what the human did. And everyone present had a model of what the human would do, and most of those models involved noise. Marcus picked up his glass. He set it down. He stood. He walked the full length of the table. He did not walk quickly. He did not alter his pace or his posture. He came to where Sera sat, placed one hand briefly on her shoulder, and looked at her face. Then he looked at Thurrek, who was still standing in the same position, crest fully elevated, watching. "That was a mistake," Marcus said. He said it quietly, in the tone he used when noting a factual error in a document. Thurrek's posture did not change. The gesture is a Vethani cultural expression recognized under the Compact's Social Conventions Appendix. Your translation unit should have rendered the full context. "It did," Marcus said. "It was still a mistake." He turned and walked back to his seat. He sat down. He picked up his tablet and began writing. The silence in the room held for several more seconds. No one quite knew what to do with the response they had received. The Vethani subordinates were watching Thurrek for a behavioral cue. The Kaelori delegation was watching Marcus. Thurrek stood where he was for a moment longer, with the look of someone who had deployed a calculated instrument and found it had not produced the expected reaction, and then walked back to his end of the table. Drathven leaned towards Sera and said something quiet and specific. Sera nodded. She wrote the time in her documentation log. Her handwriting was steady. The banquet ended within the hour. The informal social structure dissolved without ceremony. The delegations returned to their respective sections. Marcus spent the next 4 hours in the station's communication and documentation room with Drathven, Pell, and 2 of the Kaelori's legal specialists. He was not raising his voice. He was not issuing demands or threats. He was building a document. The Galactic Compact's envoy protection provisions, Article 37, defined the parameters of protected status for diplomatic envoys and their directly accredited staff during the active term of any recognized negotiation process. Sera Velde was accredited staff. Her accreditation was on formal file with the Compact's registration office. The banquet was a documented extension of the negotiation session. Under the framework agreement both parties had signed on day 1. Thurrek's gesture, regardless of its cultural framing, constituted deliberate physical contact with a protected person in a non-consensual context during a protected session. Under Article 37, this triggered a formal complaint mechanism. The mechanism suspended the offending party's ability to advance new demands during the complaint review period. It required an independent review conducted by the Compact's monitoring office, and it created a permanent formal record that could be submitted to the Compact's tribunal if the review found sufficient cause for further action. Marcus did not file the complaint that night. He prepared it completely, had it witnessed by Drathven and the station's independent monitor. and verified that every supporting document was attached and properly dated. Then he asked Pell to compile a continuous log of beacon transmission activity through passage 12 going back 7 years, cross-referenced with the Aerith encoding signature. Pell worked through the night. He did not mention the hour or the effort. He produced the log by 5 in the morning, annotated with every instance in which the Aerith beacon signature had been queried from an external source, along with the Vethani operational call signs that matched known vessels from Thurrek's faction across the previous 18 months. Marcus reviewed it. It was thorough and accurate. He told Pell this directly. He then sent a quiet message to Grand Arbiter Sok, who had arrived at the station the previous afternoon and had not announced his presence. Sok had come because Drathvin had sent him a private brief 3 days earlier, indicating that the situation was developing in directions that might require the Arbiter's direct presence. Sok was old and had held difficult authority for a long time, and knew when to arrive quietly. Marcus requested a full delegation session the following morning under the emergency assembly provision of the session protocol. No preliminary agenda was circulated. Thurrek's delegation objected through Drekth. The station's independent monitor, whose function required compliance with the protocol, regardless of party preference, overruled the objection. Thurrek arrived looking like someone who had decided the previous evening's incident was resolved, absorbed, finished. His crest was high. He sat. Marcus placed 3 documents on the table. The first was the Article 37 complaint, fully prepared, signed, witnessed, and ready for submission. The second was Pell's beacon transmission log, annotated with the Vethani operational call signs and the encoding signature analysis. The third was the communication relay record from the station's own automated systems, showing the encrypted transmission the observer guard had sent on the 4th evening. The transmission had not been decrypted. Marcus did not have the decryption capability and had not sought it. He did not need the content. The transmission metadata showed the destination address was registered to a Vethani Military Intelligence Coordination Office, 2 sectors outside Kaelori space. Marcus placed all 3 in front of Grand Arbiter Sok, who was seated at the observer position at the far end of the room. Sok had been introduced to the room without preamble. "These address 3 distinct issues," Marcus said. "I want to be precise because each one stands independently." He indicated the first document, the complaint under Article 37. This concerns the incident at last evening's session extension. The complaint is formally filed as of this moment. The review period begins immediately. During the review period, Thurrek's delegation may not advance any new demands. Existing framework items remain on the table, and scheduled sessions continue. Thurrek began to speak. Marcus continued in the same register without raising his voice. The second document concerns Passage 12 specifically. The Aerith navigational beacon network installed through that corridor during the prior joint use period was never decommissioned. It has been actively queried by Vethani registered vessels using Aerith encoding keys for a period of at least 18 months. That activity constitutes use of Kaelori-administered transit infrastructure without authorization under the transit sovereignty provisions. The Conclave is entitled to remediation, and the record is now in the formal session archive. Thurrek's crest shifted. The movement was suppressive, not dominant, He was containing something. The third document, Marcus said, is not a formal complaint or allegation. It is a record of an encrypted communication transmitted from within this negotiation to a Vethani intelligence office during an active session period. I am not in a position to characterize the content of that transmission. I am placing its existence on the formal session record because it is relevant to the context of this proceeding. He sat down. The room held a very particular quality of silence, the kind that follows the arrival of information that cannot be unarrived. Drexth leaned toward Thurrek. Thurrek did not respond to him. He was looking at Marcus with an expression that Sera, watching from her seat, later described to Voss as the face of someone who had calculated a reaction and received something outside the parameters of his calculation. Grand Arbiter Sok spoke. His voice was the unhurried voice of someone who had spent decades delivering sentences that mattered. The Article 37 complaint is received. The beacon violation requires concurrent independent review. Thurrek, your delegation's authority to advance demands is suspended pending completion of both proceedings. This is an administrative determination, not a discretionary one. Thurrek stood. His crest was at maximum elevation, but the quality of it had changed. This is a coordinated ambush under the cover of diplomatic process. It is documentation, Marcus said. Every item on that table was true before last evening. You made them relevant. Thurrek looked at him for a long moment. You are one human. You carry no personal authority against a warlord of the Vethani. I don't need personal authority, Marcus said. I filed paperwork. The paperwork carries its own. Thurrek's delegation withdrew from the station within 22 hours. The withdrawal was not announced as voluntary. The Vethani High Command, on receiving notification of the intelligence transmission record from the station's independent monitor through official channels, moved with speed to contain the developing situation. The observer guard had been placed because someone in the Vethani command structure had already suspected that Thurrek was running his own intelligence operation under the diplomatic cover. The formal record Marcus had created confirmed it in an official, archived, internationally witnessed document. Thurrek was recalled. Not through any dramatic announcement, not through a formal proceeding that would have required public acknowledgement. He simply received orders and departed, and the Vethani mission flag was lowered, and a new representative was confirmed within 4 days. Sera's face had bruised and then faded over the course of a week. She photographed the bruising on the day it was visible and included the photographs in the Article 37 file. She did this the way she documented everything, systematically with timestamps, without commentary about what it felt like to do it. The photographs were attached, and the file was closed, and the file would exist in the Compact's archive for as long as archives existed. Marcus formally withdrew the Article 37 complaint against Thurrek's faction, though not against Thurrek personally, when the new Vethani representative issued a formal statement of clarification regarding the incident at the banquet. The statement did not use the Vethani word for apology. It used the term for acknowledgement of procedural deviation, which was the closest analog available in Vethani diplomatic language. Marcus accepted the statement on behalf of the Conclave delegation in writing. He noted in the acceptance that the original complaint remained archived and could be reinstated. This was not a dramatic statement. It was accurate. He noted it because accuracy was the entire point. The new representative asked in the opening of the first session, after the withdrawal, whether the events of the previous week would color the ongoing negotiation. "Not the negotiation," Marcus said. "The record keeps its own memory." The new representative was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I understand." Marcus believed him. The man had read the documents. The corridor negotiation concluded 17 days after Thurrek's departure. Passage 19 was formalized under a joint transit arrangement with an independent monitoring mechanism and quarterly review provisions. Passages 7 and 12 remained under full Kaelori sovereignty. Specific Vethani commercial transit rights through Passage 12 were filed under standard protocols, with the explicit condition that the Aerith Beacon network be formally decommissioned under compact supervision within 60 days, with Vethani technical cooperation required. In exchange, the Kaelori provided structured access to a Vethani-operated deep space refueling infrastructure in the outer sectors, a material concession that had not been on the table at any point during Thurrek's sessions. Because Thurrek had never indicated a Vethani willingness to offer it, the new representative had, on the third day, indicated a willingness to discuss it. The discussion had taken 2 sessions and produced a workable structure. Neither side received everything it had arrived wanting. Both sides received something real, which was, as Marcus had stated in the opening framework document, on day 1, the only kind of outcome with a functional lifespan. Grand Arbiter. Soak met with Marcus privately on the final afternoon. The Arbiter moved with the deliberate economy of someone whose body had spent decades accommodating the weight of difficult decisions. He sat across from Marcus and was quiet for a moment, in the way that indicated he was composing something, not that he lacked something to say. "Your response at the banquet was not what I anticipated," Soak said. "What did you anticipate?" "Something immediate, anger, a demand for public acknowledgement, something Thurrek could receive and counter." Marcus considered this. He was good at receiving and countering. He had done it 3 times before. I needed him to encounter something outside his response framework. And that was? Someone who had already finished building the case and was just waiting for the right moment to file it, Marcus said. "The banquet gave me the moment. Everything else was already prepared." Soak was quiet for a moment. "Your species is more deliberate than the documentation suggests." "We vary considerably," Marcus said. "But we do tend to keep records, and we do tend to finish what we start." The ripple moved outward through the diplomatic networks faster than either Marcus or Drathven had anticipated. The session records were sealed to the participant level, meaning the specific documents were not available to external parties. But outcomes were documented and outcomes moved. A Vethani warlord had entered a negotiation with the stated intent of extracting 3 transit corridors, had been operating it as cover for an intelligence collection operation, had attempted to destabilize the proceeding through a deliberate act of social aggression against a protected party, and had been removed from the table through the systematic application of existing compact provisions. By a human envoy working with a Kaelori documentary team. The method was not dramatic, it was reproducible. 4 separate administrative briefings in 2 different treaty organizations referenced it within 6 weeks. Drathven wrote a formal assessment for the Kaelori Conclave's diplomatic archive. She described the human approach as the systematic use of continuous record integrity as an active negotiating instrument. She noted that its effectiveness depended on two conditions: the discipline never to use the record prematurely, and the willingness to use it completely when the moment arrived. She noted that both conditions had been satisfied. She did not write in the formal assessment what she wrote in her private log, which was that what had made the whole operation function was not any single strategy or any particular moment of competence, but the combination of an envoy who treated consistency as a form of applied pressure and an analyst who had seen what everyone else in the room had been looking past. The two of them had accomplished what a Kaelori team 4 times their size had not managed, and they had done it without requiring alignment meetings or coordinated signaling, because they had been working toward the same documented outcome from the beginning. Pell received a formal commendation from Drath Ven's office within the month. 6 months later, he received an offer to join the newly established Conclave Transit Intelligence Division, which had not existed as an independent office before the Beacon Network revelation made the need for it obvious. He accepted the position. He sent Marcus a brief message when the appointment was confirmed. Marcus replied with 2 sentences. He was glad, and he was not surprised. Pell kept the message. The Vethani situation became a reference case in the human diplomatic corps within the year. Not a famous one, not a cautionary tale told in ceremony. The quieter kind, the sort that gets cited in training appendices and briefing footnotes, filed under the category of cases where a specific maneuver had been attempted against a human delegation and had produced an outcome outside the expected parameters. The element that was cited most consistently was not the Article 37 filing. It was not the beacon documentation or the transmission record. It was the moment at the banquet, the moment when the room had waited for Marcus Velde to produce something loud and immediate that Thurrek could absorb and turn, and had instead watched him walk the length of a room at an unaltered pace, check on the person he was responsible for, look at the individual who had made the error, and say 4 words without raising his voice. That was a mistake. Then sit down and start writing. Species that studied human behavioral responses spent time on that moment specifically. The analysis usually came back to the same question, framed in different ways. Was what was observed in that room restraint, or was it something else entirely? The answer, which the various analyses never quite settled on, was that it was neither restraint in the classical sense, nor its absence. It was a different category. Restraint implied an impulse that was being actively suppressed. What Marcus had displayed was not suppression. It was the absence of a gap between the provocation and the plan, because the plan had existed before the provocation arrived. He had looked at the room and seen exactly what had occurred, and recognized it as the final piece of documentation he had needed. And the thing that looked from the outside like composure was simply the continued execution of work that had already been in progress. Thurrek had looked across the table, waiting for a reaction that would give him something to work with. He had received instead a man noting a new entry in an ongoing record. What Thurrek had not understood, and what most beings who had not worked alongside humans in high-pressure settings did not understand, was that the specific combination of a thorough documentation practice, an institutional memory that did not soften with time, and the deep structure conviction that accountability without follow-through was not accountability at all, produced something that looked like patience from a distance. It was not patience. It was commitment. It was the thing that meant Marcus Velde had known from the day the briefing was put in his hands what the final state of this proceeding needed to look like, and had been building toward it through every session, every procedural note, every log transmission time, every conversation with a maintenance supervisor about where the station's vulnerabilities were. Thurrek had arrived with a calculation of what the human across the table was. He had forgotten to account for what the human had already prepared before he got there. Sera Velde published a technical paper 11 months after the negotiation. It addressed the cross-species interpretation of dominant posture physical contact in diplomatic settings, with particular focus on the gap between cultural framing and compact provision applicability. It was a precise paper, carefully argued, fully cited. It became a standard reference document in the certification program for diplomatic cultural analysts assigned to Vethani adjacent species. The paper did not name anyone. It did not describe a banquet or a bruise or the specific quality of a room going still. It did not need to. The methodology stood on its own, and the methodology was the point. She was already writing the next paper when this one was accepted. A young diplomat in training asked Marcus, 3 years after the Vethis-Anchor negotiation, what he had actually experienced in the moment at the banquet when Thurrek struck his wife. It was asked directly and honestly, and Marcus took it seriously. Focused, he said. Not calm in the way the word usually means. Focused. When something significant happens, you have 2 directions you can put your attention. You can put it into the feeling in that moment, or you can put it into what comes next. I chose the second one. The young diplomat said, "That sounds difficult." It was not difficult at the banquet, Marcus said. The difficult part was the 5 days before it. Keeping the same file open every morning without doing anything with it until the documentation was complete. That required patience. The banquet just required knowing that the file was ready. And were you certain it would be enough? Marcus thought about this honestly. I was certain it was accurate. Accuracy was what I had. Everything else depended on the compact's mechanisms functioning the way they were designed to function, and on Pell finding what he found, and on Drathvian holding the session together when it needed holding, and on Sera seeing what she saw in the guard rotation on day 4. The part I did was the part I was there to do. Everything else was other people doing theirs. The young diplomat wrote this down. Marcus noticed and said nothing further. The young diplomat had already understood the part that mattered. There is a quality that experienced negotiators learn to look for in the people they work alongside, and it does not reveal itself under ordinary conditions. It appears only under the specific combination of high stakes, direct insult, and the weight of a room full of observers waiting for a response. What you are watching for in that moment is whether the person's behavior under maximum pressure is recognizably continuous with who they were on the first day. Most people shift. Under sufficient pressure, they become louder or quieter, or more careful or less careful than their baseline. The pressure changes them because the pressure is larger than the commitment they arrived with. The rare ones, the ones who are genuinely difficult to work against when they have decided something, stay recognizably the same. Not because they are made of something harder than feeling. Because they made a decision about what they were going to do before the pressure arrived. And the pressure did not update that decision. It only updated the timeline. What Thurrek had not known, and what most beings who had not worked in close partnership with humans under genuine pressure did not know, was that this particular combination of thorough documentation, long institutional memory, and absolute conviction that accountability meant follow-through through to completion produced something that looked like patience from a distance and was actually something with considerably more structure to it. Thurrek struck Sera Velde at a banquet and looked across a long table, expecting to see the heat of a response he could navigate. He saw instead a man who had already finished writing the response, who only needed a time to enter in the record. He had provided the time. The rest was just completing the paperwork. If a story like this settled in and stayed, consider sharing it with someone who recognizes the difference between noise and patience with a very good memory. The stories that last are the ones that find the people who notice.